Do you want to protect your heart while running so you can keep running for many years to come? I feel like the logical answer is yes. It makes total sense to prioritize our heart health because a strong heart is pivotal to running longevity. In this video, we're going to show you why your heart is a little bit vulnerable while running and why tracking your heart rate is so important, particularly as you get older. Before we look at the warning signs, let's look at the changes that happen in our heart while we run.
During each bout of exercise, there are changes in our heart rate which are literally in relation to the demands of the task. So effectively the heart, every time it pumps, what it's doing is moving blood around the body. And the blood is the transport system for the oxygen and energy substrate that needs to go to the working muscles and to remove the carbon dioxide and byproducts of energy metabolism from the muscles out. And so the heart rate changes literally in response to how much oxygen we need and how much energy we need to perform the task that we are doing. Therefore, there's a direct correlation between heart rate and exercise intensity. What that means is that as exercise intensity increases, so does our heart rate. Because as we push harder, our body demands more oxygen, more energy. And in response to that, our heart rate goes up so that the heart can pump more blood faster to get to the working muscles. Now, over time, our body becomes much more efficient at both processing that oxygen, processing energy, and using it to get what it needs. The body itself undergoes changes in terms of how efficiently it can control the capillaries and blood vessels, in other words, opening them wider and closing them up. And so your heart rate over time at equal intensities will come down as you get fitter. So if you're someone who finds it reasonably easy to run at, let's say, 8-minute miles or 5 minutes per kilometer, but your heart rate is say 145 to 150, over time, if that is actually the right zone and you are in fact running easy enough for you, what you'll find is that over time, that 8 minutes per mile or 5 minutes per kilometer, your body will be able to sustain at maybe 140 to 145 beats per minute.
Now that Lindsay has covered what changes your heart rate while you're exercising, how do you determine if your heart rate is high during exercise? There isn't a sort of blanket approach. Not everyone is going to have that same effect. So I can't say to you that a high heart rate equals this, because everyone will have a slightly different response. But the main thing for you to figure out if you have a higher heart rate during training is how you're feeling. So if you are feeling that those runs aren't easy, you're not recovering well in those sessions, your heart rate is probably responding a little bit higher. And people often say to me, well, you know, Shona, I can't run slower or slow my heart rate down because my heart rate is high. And that's not often the case. The fact is that you may not be aerobically fit enough, and that's why your heart rate is responding a little bit higher. How do you work out if your heart rate is high? So you could do a max heart rate test. Try and stay away from the age-related formula, so the 220 minus age, because those do have a lot of variance, and in particular, the older we get. And I'm going to touch on that in just a little bit. But if you're wanting to determine your maximum heart rate, you could go and do a maximum heart rate test in a lab specifically. That'll be really great to just a ramp protocol, so slowly building yourself up until we figure out what your maximum heart rate is. The downsides of those tests is very often you have to find a balance between your actual maximum heart rate or your central and peripheral fatigue. So the fatigue that's happening while you're running versus how quickly we can get you to that maximum heart rate. So sometimes that is not always a true reflection of what that maximum heart rate is, but it will give you a bit of an indication. If you don't have access to a lab, you can do a field-based test. So something like 400 meter repeats, so 3 to 4 times 400 meters. So you do a 400 meter, rest a minute, another 400 meter, rest a minute, and another 400 meter. And from there, you'll start to get an idea of where your maximum heart rate lies. Once you have that maximum heart rate, you can then check what percentage you are running at in your session. So of that maximum heart rate, I am essentially running at 85 to 90% of that max. That means that you're probably then just extending yourself a little bit too far or hard in your sessions and running a little bit too hard, as opposed to just your heart rate responding high. Maximum heart rate does become a little bit more contentious to look at and measure as we age. We do see changes in our heart rates, and in particular in our maximum heart rate, as we're getting older. And so I'd avoid using something like this to really measure up against as you're getting older.
There is quite a strong genetic link to heart rates, both in terms of our resting heart rate and in terms of our maximum heart rate. Both of these things will have an impact on the functioning of the heart and how you use the information to adjust your training. The most important fact to pull out of that is that each one of you is a unique individual, and by tracking and analyzing your heart rate, you can learn what your maximum heart rate is, what your threshold heart rate is, what your resting heart rate is, and then you use that information to track how your fitness is progressing over time, and also to use your heart rate to allow you to determine when you are overtraining and when you are really starting to improve your fitness.
Why does age impact your heart rate like this? Why do you see your maximum heart rate start to slowly come down? And essentially the reason is you're losing lean muscle mass as we age. And the heart is a muscle, right? The surrounding features around the heart is cardiac muscle. And so you will lose some aspects of that muscle as you're getting older. There's also a change in the elasticity of that muscle. So the heart can't essentially pump out as much blood as it used to when we were younger. And so that is why you start seeing that maximum heart rate slowly come down.
As with a lot of parameters around running, they are only useful if we track them over time and we learn how we respond to certain stimulus over time. Heart rate is a very easy way of determining how your training is going, but it's important to track both the resting heart rate as well as your in-exercise heart rate for easy runs and interval workouts. Because if you compare data across runs, then you can start to see what impact you are having if you are recovering well and or if you are starting to run into overtraining. So with resting heart rate, that's the simplest one to explain, so we'll start there. When we track resting heart rate over time, as you get fitter and your body becomes more efficient, there will be a slight drop in resting heart rate in response to you getting fitter. And that's not really the important part of the resting heart rate. What we want to see is, when does resting heart rate start to go up? It'll go up slowly at first if we are starting to go into overtraining or under recovery. And typically, as long as that number doesn't go beyond 3 or 4 beats up, then your normal sort of recovery cycle in a week should allow that to come back down in the week. But I would be mindful of doing high intensity exercise during that period when there's a slight increase. If there's a jump beyond 5, when you start to get 5, 8, and 10 beats above normal resting, that means that you either quickly slipped into overtraining or pushing yourself too far, or quite possibly that you are getting sick, or that there's something amiss that is impacting on you, and it will impact on your training. If you carry on training as normal, you're either going to get very sick or you're going to get injured. So that is how you'll use your resting heart rate to track if you should carry on with your training or modify your training. In exercise is a little bit more complicated. Initially, when you start to go into overtraining, or if you start to get tired, your exercising heart rate will be a little bit higher than what you're expecting or what you're used to. Now, if that happens for 1 to 2 runs in a row, it's not too dramatic, and you can probably carry on training but avoid doing hard sessions. If, however, you ignore that, the next step will come that your heart rate will suddenly appear much lower than what you expect it to be at certain intensities. And when that happens, when you're doing high intensity workouts in particular, that is not a sign that you are getting much fitter and more efficient. That is a sign that the body can't use all the muscles available to it. And so what's actually happening is that you've got a smaller amount of muscles trying to do the work that you're setting for it, and there's a decreased demand on the heart, and so you can't get your heart rate up to those normal levels. And that is often a classic sign of being very tired and overtrained, and you must in fact then take it easy. When you're doing interval sessions, it's another really great way of determining what is happening and what your training status is. When you do the actual interval, we want to be able to push that heart rate up. And as we get fitter, you'll actually be able to demand more from your body, which often means that at your high intensity workouts, there's a slight increase in the heart rate that you're able to sustain for those intervals. And what happens next when you go into your recovery interval, when you stop running, is that your heart rate will drop rapidly. The faster that heart rate drops, the better aerobic state you are in, the better training status you have, and the more recovered you are. And so by comparing those slopes, if you've got a nice steep gradient of recovery and your heart rate is bottoming out nicely at the end of each recovery session, and it's comparable or better than sessions before it, great training status. If it's taking longer for that heart rate to come down between similar workouts that you compare with in the past, it's another sign that you're carrying excessive fatigue and you actually need to slow your training down, give yourself a little bit more recovery time. What happens if you are running at a high heart rate, or put better, when you are running at too high a heart rate for you as an individual? You actually pull down your running economy and you pull down your threshold. So when you are training, what you want to do is to be training at around about 70 to 75% your maximum heart rate. Lots of people think that by pushing that heart rate up a little bit higher, they are actually getting fitter and they are expending more energy. Now, if you are someone who's exercising purely for a weight loss point of view, then that might be true, that you get to burn more calories if you have a limited amount of time. However, from a performance point of view, what that does is it actually stunts your aerobic ability. It stunts your body's ability to give your working muscles energy by using oxygen, using oxidative pathways, and it forces you into pathways that make you use carbohydrates and provide that energy without oxygen. And as soon as that happens, you start to create metabolites which indirectly are part of the fatigue process. In short, you'll get tired much quicker at similar intensities. So it's really important that you work out what your correct heart rate zones are at, so that you do the majority of your training at between 70 and 75% of your maximum heart rate, and that will make sure that we push that aerobic system really high, make you super efficient, make you really good at running fast for long distances.
Let's touch a little bit on resting heart rates and how you determine whether or not your resting heart rate is higher than normal. So how do we measure resting heart rate? Let's just make sure that this is key, because if you're not measuring it correctly, you can't say whether or not you're getting a decent measure or whether or not that is higher or lower. So you wake up in the morning, before you go to the bathroom, take a measurement of your resting heart rate for a minute. So you can either use your watch, hold that watch tight against your wrist so that you're getting a valid measurement, or I actually prefer the old school way, 2 fingers on your pulse on your wrist or here on your pulse over here. Measure that for a minute and track that number every day over time. You want to start seeing any changes that you have in that number. So it's not a question of what is a higher resting heart rate or what is a lower resting heart rate. Every single person is individual. So the most important thing here is how your resting heart rate changes. It's not about whether 70 is a higher number or worse number than someone who has a resting heart rate of 50. If your resting heart rate is 52 consistently over time, that is the important thing about how that number changes. not necessarily what is a high number or a low number or what is a good number.
How do we work out what the right heart rate is for you? So there are two methods. We can work that out on a maximum heart rate, which is the easier of the two ways, potentially the slightly less safe, or we can do an estimated threshold, and I'll talk you through both. So when we work out our maximum heart rate, you want to make sure that you've been training for a good 3 to 6 weeks. You want to make sure you've been doing quite a lot of aerobic training, a couple of gentle intervals, and then you'll put yourself into a workout. Preferably, I like to do this on a hill because it tends to bring out the best results. So you want to get a hill that takes you somewhere between 2.5, 3 minutes to run that hill, and you're going to do 5 repetitions to the absolute best of your ability, walking down each time to make sure that you recover properly. That workout will take you very close to what your maximum heart rate is. Then you will simply take 70 to 75% of that number, and that becomes your easy running zone. That becomes a zone that you want to spend between 80 and 90% of all your running volume running, because that'll ensure that you run easy enough and develop aerobically to the best of your ability. You can also use threshold heart rate. What is threshold heart rate? Threshold heart rate is essentially the intensity that you can hold for between 35 and 40 minutes before you are exhausted. So typically we can estimate that from using between a 5 and an 8 kilometer time trial. For most people will get to that 30, 35, 40 minute range between a 5 and an 8 kilometer time trial, and we take the average heart rate for the time trial. So we exclude the warm-up and the cool down, and we're looking at the heart rate for that really hard 35 to 40 minute effort. That average heart rate, you will then create a training zone of 80%, and 80% then becomes your upper limit for your really easy training runs and will ensure that you stay in zone 2. The last thing that I'll share with you around heart rates is that if you are just starting out running and you can't do one of those tests because you A, are too unfit, and B, it does put you at a risk of injury, is to use Dr. Phil Maffetone's method of 180 minus age. And then at Coach Parry, when we get athletes that are 50 years older, we like to use 190 minus age, and that will give you a really nice general number to start on, so that you can do those 3 to 6 weeks of easy running that we know are on aerobic level, to prepare your body to do one of the two tests, either the threshold test or the max heart rate test, and then work out your heart rate for you as an individual.
So knowing all of this, how do we use the heart rates in training to build a really, really strong and solid base? As I mentioned earlier, if you're responding really, really high in your sessions in relation to your maximum heart rate, or in relation to even to your threshold heart rates, we want to be able to bring that heart rate down so that you're not overexerting yourself in your sessions. For maximum aerobic development, we want to ensure that we're working in a specific zone with regards to heart rates. It's generally quite a low zone. It's quite an easy sort of set of training. And so the goal here is to work at a certain heart rate intensity, and that's the pace, and over time stay at that same heart rate but get a little bit quicker. So what is happening there is that your body is utilizing less fuel, or the heart doesn't have to work as hard to go a little bit faster. And that's the goal of endurance training, and getting a little bit fitter and faster. And so how we do this in our training is we want to work at around 75 to 85% of our threshold heart rates, and keep that for 80% of our training over a weekly or monthly period.
Of course, when it comes to any training, not just training to heart rate, we must take into account cardiac risk factors. And so if you or someone in your close family has suffered from hypertension or any other cardiac issues, it's always a really good idea to get yourself cleared medically for doing some exercise. In almost all instances, you will be recommended to do some cardiovascular exercise to help you to rehabilitate your heart and to improve your cardiac risk. But then it becomes very, very important that you limit yourself to zone 2 exercise and avoid getting your heart rate over 80% of maximum, because that's typically the space in which you will then put your heart under stress, and if there are some underlying risk factors, that can cause you an issue. If you are sick, you shouldn't exercise while you are sick. So cardiac muscle is smooth muscle, it's highly resistant to disease, except when it is under stress itself. So if you do have a viral infection and then you go out and exercise, when the heart rate starts to go up, then the heart is under stress, and that is the opportunity for that virus to get into your heart to pick up myocarditis or pericarditis. So when sick, avoid exercise, and when coming back from illness, it's very important to use heart rate to gauge the intensity that you should be training at, and you should always be training in zone 2 or lower. So that's 70 to 75% of maximum or 80% of threshold that we spoke about earlier. You want to limit yourself to that. Initially, what you'll find if you're recovering from a serious illness, that at those heart rates, your pace is going to be significantly slower than what you are used to. And that's okay, because as that pace improves, that will be your sign that you are in fact fully recovered from the illness that you are suffering from.
Tracking your heart rate not only provides you important information about your fitness level and recovery, but also serves as a warning system for potential risks for running at a high heart rate for extended periods. Training to heart rate is the proven way to go, but how do you do it? So watch this video next to find out exactly how to get the most out of your watch's heart rate functionality. And as always, if you do have any concerns about your heart, please do consult your medical practitioner to get the help that you need.